Hey everyone, I made a slight mention about how Democrats and Republicans were different earlier in United States history. When people talk about the switch, it is largely how the majority of both parties tackled the issue of race. Both parties changed other aspects of their policies such as economics, foreign policy, and criminal justice to address the current issues they saw throughout the years to varying degrees. Before I talk about the gradual switch, I'm going to describe the origins of the earliest incarnations of the parties I could find. A party known as the Democrat-Republican Party adhered to Thomas Jefferson's idea of limiting central government's intervention of individuals' liberties, which is why Thomas Jefferson, as president, often vetoed the legislature in favor of a less active government. It's understandable, the American Revolutionary War was not too long ago, so people were wary of a government with too much economic and political power. There were times when federal actions were needed, and that was during foreign affairs such as the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Oh yeah, that came back. However, not everyone agreed with that, and actually wanted the government to be more active. There would be an event that will lead to a split in the Democratic-Republican Party, and that will be the 1824 election. 4 candidates will run for president under the Democrat-Republican Party, named John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Although Andrew Jackson received the most electoral votes, 99, none of the candidates received the amount needed to win, which was 131. The House decided to elect John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson felt the people were cheated of their votes because he did get the most electoral votes after all. He formed the Democratic Party and ran as the first Democrat, and the Whig Party would be created to oppose the Democrats. By the mid-1800s, the American party system was dominated by the two parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. There will be this reoccurring theme of Northerners versus Southerners, even while explaining the switch. While Democrats and Whigs have members of various perspectives, you could group ideologies together based on if they were from the North or the South. What led to the split in the Whig Party was the issue of slavery. There were events before this leading up to its downfall, but this was considered the final straw. While the Democrats were generally pro-slavery, Andrew Jackson had more than plenty of slaves himself, the Whigs had a mixture of anti-slavery members and those who didn't take a strong stance on the issue either way. A legislation called the Missouri Compromise made Maine a free state when Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and lands above the 36.5 parallel, except Missouri, were to be free states. But the signing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed slavery in the Northern Territory. Outraged, the anti-slavery Whigs would form the Republican Party in 1854, gaining support from Northerners. The Republicans at this time supported free market labor, giving land to farmers, and small government. Much like the industrializing Northern and agricultural Southern ideologies split the Whig Party, it would split the now dominant Democrat Party, setting the stage for civil war. The year is 1860, and a very divisive election for presidency is taking place due to rising tensions between the North and South. It was so tense that the Northern and Southern Democrats couldn't agree on a candidate to represent them. The Northern Democrats wanted people in each state to vote on the issue of slavery, while the Southern Democrats wanted it to be a nationwide thing. For the 1860 election, the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, and the Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge. The former Whigs from the South created a party called the Constitutional Union because they didn't want to join either Democrats or Republicans, and nominated John Bell to run for president. This moderate party only succeeded in splitting the vote, which led to a Republican candidate winning, Abraham Lincoln, thus serving as the catalyst for the South seceding from the Union and the United States erupting into civil war. After the war, the Republicans became the dominant party from 1869 to 1933, and only 2 Democrats would be elected during this time, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. Interesting enough, for a lack of a better word, Woodrow Wilson was a supporter of this historical revisionist myth called the Lost Cause, which claims that the Confederate States' fight in the war was heroic and not about slavery. It's no wonder why the Southern Democrats loved Woodrow Wilson when he was in office in 1913 to 1921. By the 1900s, the Democrats with Southern roots had strong presence in Congress. They were still beaten in presidential elections, but their grip on Southern states was strong. During the 1930s, a severe economic depression would hit the United States after a huge fall in stock prices at the end of the 1920s. This will cause a chain reaction which will affect other nations, but I'm keeping this focused on America. Tax revenue for the government and profits would drop and unemployment would rise. The last Republican president during the Republican dominant era was Herbert Hoover from 1929 to 1933, and he was looked at unfavorably because his core Republican ideas just wasn't what was needed to help during the Great Depression. Remember, Republicans generally still believed in free markets and small government, so he refused to provide economic relief from the federal government when government intervention was needed. This is why Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat-Republican, won in a landslide victory in both northern and southern states because Herbert Hoover was now seen as a source of the problem. In 1933, FDR would enact a program called the New Deal, which sought out to help those who were unemployed and poor return the economy back to normal functioning levels and reform the economic system to prevent another Great Depression. Black people who would normally vote Republican began to shift to voting Democrat because the New Deal also helped them during this time. Even though the Northern and Southern Democrats supported the New Deal at the beginning, by the end of it, a conservative faction was soon developed to counter this left-leaning economic program. This will also happen with the Republican Party. The West and Midwestern states were conservative, and the Northeastern states were liberal. These liberal Republicans were the descendants of those progressive Republicans I mentioned before. The conservative Democrats didn't like FDR, so they formed a coalition with the conservative Republicans to counter him and his liberal policies. Similar to the party switch among black voters, many white Southerners will vote for Republican candidate Dwight Eisenhower in the 1952 election because they've become disillusioned from the Democratic Party. The previous president was Harry Truman, and he integrated the military and took actions in favor of black people. Outraged, the conservative white politicians formed the Dixiecrat political party, which sought to maintain racial segregation and white supremacy. They would nominate Strom Thurmond in the 1948 election to run against Harry Truman, but after the loss, the Dixiecrats would dissolve and begrudgingly rejoin the Democrats. As I said before, the Republicans had a liberal and conservative split, and Dwight Eisenhower was from the conservative side. He was a moderate, but his conservative views were attractive to the Southern conservatives. He basically served as a bridge for them to vote for him. The events that would really push Southern Democrats to switch to the Republican Party would be the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson. John F. Kennedy tried to get it passed but was met with strong opposition, but Lyndon B. Johnson took a different and more aggressive approach to get it passed. Lyndon B. Johnson's actions as president alienated the Southern Democrats so much that ex-Dixiecrat candidate Strom Thurmond would run as a Republican because he felt the Democrat Party no longer represented people like him. Interpret that as you will. While the voter base for each party has begun switching parties, it will take one more presidency to solidify the party's stances on racial issues as we know today. During the 1968 presidential election, Republicans would appeal to Southerners' racial attitudes through something called the Southern Strategy to gain their support, essentially using the notion of states' rights to oppose federal passing of the Civil Rights Act. Being overt was becoming unfavorable, so strategies that target black people without outright saying it was effective, and Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater would be the ones utilizing this. The Southern strategy didn't just appeal to their racial attitudes, it included women's place in society in a conservative sense, white evangelical Christianity, and the government's role in the economy. This wasn't a fast flip because it would take decades more to perfect this. Democrat Jimmy Carter would get votes from the South in 1976. However, this might have something to do with the fact that he was from the South. But the Southern strategy would eventually set the stage for Republicans today. Back to 1964, Southern states, whether Democrat or Republican, supported the Southern strategy. With Richard Nixon in office, that created a strong pull which brought more conservative Democrats to the Republican Party. Even Strom Thurmond reinforced this by saying, if Nixon becomes the president, he has promised that he won't enforce either the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Acts. Stick with him. My gosh, who hurt this guy? Eventually, more liberals will make their home with Democrats and likewise with conservatives with Republicans. This was a long, multi-generational change, and while the parties had diverse members, you could easily divide their ideologies through regional lines. The switch wasn't perfect because while liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans are the majority in their respective parties, conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans still exist till this day. This can explain why some of them cross party lines at times. Probably less often in recent times, but it happens. The switch of the party's racial ideologies was a gradual one, which is why it's very difficult to answer exactly when they switched. But if I had to pick a definitive moment, it would be the Civil Rights era. That was something you couldn't ignore. You were either for or against it, and sides were taken. As stated before, the parties would change over time in other aspects, not just in their racial perspectives, but the racial aspect is what many people think of when searching this topic. For example, while the majority of Democrats remained socially liberal, they become fiscally conservative by the late 1980s, and some could argue they haven't changed that since then. Will the party split like that again? Maybe, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. If anything, I think a different change is going to occur. Much like the parties of the past, having multiple perspectives within them, leading towards a majority shift, we're seeing that happen today. Populism is growing within both parties, and that will result in them changing to address the issues of today in their own way. Populism is more or less a political movement emphasizing the difference between the common people and the elites. Where this will lead to, I don't know. I'm living in the moment. If you want to keep this channel going or help fund my upcoming series, you can become a patron. The link is down below and any amount is greatly appreciated. Anyways, I gotta go. Be nice to one another and take care of yourselves.